We are Entras. Together, we build software for controlling flexible assets for the industry.
We strongly believe that the future will be flexible. Any industry, big or small, any building, any home will make use and make profit out of flexibility.
That future starts now. In this podcast series, Flexing the Future, we share our insights on flexibility.
Welcome to another episode of Flexing the Future, the Entras podcast. Today we're going to talk about energy storage, and maybe not quite what you would expect. With me is Jeroen, one of the co-founders of Entras. So welcome, Jeroen.
Thanks.
Let's dive into the energy storage question. So what is meant with energy storage?
Well, energy is broader than electricity, but in any case, when I was younger, then they taught me, electricity cannot be stored. We know by now it's not entirely true. You have this huge wave of big, large-scale batteries coming online in the grid, also all the batteries in the electric cars and so on. So yes, by now we can store also electricity, but electricity as such is often not stored. It's actually, in the case of a battery, it's chemical energy stored in a lithium-ion chemical compound. So that is one way to look at it, but that is a too narrow view on things. That would be, I would say, the typical two-way storage. You can use electricity, store it, and again export or sell electricity.
But we go broader than that.
Yeah, we go broader than that, especially in the industrial context, because sometimes they need electricity directly in their end process to make a pump rotate or something. But often and more often they use heat typically as a driver, or cold or other energy vectors. And these energy vectors are often much easier to store than electricity. Typically, if you want, the food companies, typically there's a lot of hot water used. The storage of energy in a hot water buffer tank is relatively easy, low capex. It's not very complex. It's much cheaper than storing energy in lithium-ion battery. And you can also go to higher temperatures. Sometimes we call it hot rocks in a box, but you can really store 500 degrees temperature also. So that is thermal storage. And actually you can go one step further, where you really have, if a production facility makes products, often there is an energy needed to make the product, and so there's typically so many megawatt hours of energy in a product. So if you can impact the speed at which this product leave the factory, then you can also somehow have an element of storage. So I would say that the narrow view is on electricity, and you can use it and export it later. I store it, offtake the electricity and then export it later. That's the narrow view. In a more broad view, you can store energy in other forms, and typically, because an industrial process has a demand, they have a demand for heat. You don't need this two-way option. Basically, it is more a matter of being able to shift in time your energy consumption. And if you look at it this way, then you will notice there is a lot of storage available in industrial factories.
Sure, because every cookie in a warehouse, or even every liter of beer in a tank, it's storage, in fact.
Exact, yes. So is it. But Jens, a question for you. So there is so much storage potential. Why is this important to use that potential?
Well, this is becoming more and more important, and I think that the main driver is renewables. We all know that renewables had known a massive uptake, and it's going faster every year. So with this, mostly sun and wind, PV panels, wind turbines, we produce lots of electricity, and we produce it at moments when there is sun and when there is wind. And that's an issue, I would say, because that's not how we used to look at electricity. Before it was just produced when we need it. Now it is produced when there is wind and sun, and maybe also during times that we don't need it. So why is energy storage important? Is so that we can capture this renewable electricity, store it in some kind of way, and then use it later on when we want to, or when we can use it.
So basically it's restoring the supply and demand balance And in the past it was solved by steering the supply side. Now you also can steer the demand side, but also have additional equipment basically that stores and so restore supply and demand.
Indeed, yeah. So I think we still have a very strong focus on try to consume the electricity when it is produced, consume it directly, that you don't need to store it. Because of course, when you store it in some kind of form, a chemical form, in a battery or heat in a certain heat buffer, and then use it later on, there will always be losses. And so from a thermodynamic view, if you store, 500-degree heat in hot rocks in a box, as you say, and you store it for 5 days, you can have the best installation you want, but you will have some loss to the environment. Yeah. So energy storage is to my opinion, the second best thing to do with renewable electricity, apart from using it directly.
Immediately. Yeah. Okay, that is a good point. So, storage of energy is vital also for the new energy system we are heading to. So, how can we increase that storage? Can you give some specific examples on how you could, in practice, do it in industries?
Well, I think what we mentioned is lithium-ion. So, how can you increase? You build additional batteries.
Yes.
That's a very capex intensive business. You build this asset especially to store electricity. But we take a more industry view, and there, in fact, storage is not something new. Storage has been always there in the form of hot water tanks, for example, or in the form of chemical buffers with chemical products. So increase storage, yes, by building extra batteries, but also just by building, a larger tank for an intermediate product that you produce at your chemical site or industrial site.
Or maybe these buffers and these tanks, they are already there, but not used economically.
That's also a point.
Because I think that typically if you have a CHP, cogeneration, typically in the food sector where they typically need hot water, there is almost always a hot water tank. Let's say 100,000 liters of hot water is not so expensive to do. It was there. It was not there to be used as a storage. It was there to just for operational constraints, maybe the peaks in the demand to flatten out so that the CHP could run baseload. But they are there. So the assets are already there. And I think now in this new situation where now prices have become volatile, you could use the same existing installation, but use it in a different way.
Yeah. So what you mean with increasing storage is not really building additional batteries or tanks, but also just look at what is there and use it more efficiently. Maybe that also increases the use of the storage.
Yeah, in the first wave, I would say that is the lower hanging fruit. Of course, it requires that you can monitor the state of things. So that, for instance, if it's a buffer, that you have some predictability that you will not completely deplete the buffer and then bring the process in trouble. So you still have to somehow protect the upper and the lower limit until where you can go. But okay, that is why we make software.
But maybe we can give like a concrete example of a hot water storage or steam storage.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one of them is it's a factory, and they need lots of heat to grow their crops in their greenhouses. They used to make their heat with the gas-fired boiler, and then I think about 20 years ago or 15 years ago, the CHP got some foot in the door in the greenhouse sector, and then I think the buffers also became interesting. Because before we had just heat with gas, and we just burned the gas when we needed the heat. But then the CHP came in, and indeed, as you say, the CHP, the idea was to run at baseload, but the heat demand of the greenhouse is not necessarily baseload, or is not necessarily matched with how to operate the CHP. So in this sector, lots of heat storages were built that time. And what we see now is that they are even complementing this system with gas boiler and CHP with an additional asset being the electric boiler. And the heat storage is already there. So this makes it a really interesting case in optimizing this energy storage and in fact making use of the renewable energy, renewable electricity, put it in heat pump or electric boiler and use this heat storage and then later on provide the heat to the greenhouse.
Yeah, and probably the interesting thing of the CHP is I would say, a bit of a slower system. You cannot start it and stop it like this. There are some operational limits to that. While the e-boiler, that is a very flexible equipment. You can steer it every second, every minute.
Exactly.
You can very quickly. So that also, we will talk about it later, gives access to more markets. While with the CHP, you will probably not be active on all the markets, but while with an e-boiler, it's a very fast equipment. You can do a lot of things. I also have an example of where you could store inside the process. One actually, which has been since many years been doing that. They were front runners in that, were the chloralkali electrolyzer. So an electrolysis, so you use electricity to separate water, but in the process make chlorine gas. And typically these buffers of this chlorine, they have buffers of several days of storage. And then by forecasting prices for the next days, you could, also on spot markets, so I will talk about the markets a bit later, but also on relative slow markets, you could optimize and try to make that chlorine gas with the cheapest possible prices, the moments where prices are cheapest. And in essence, if you look at it, that chlorine buffer is a battery, is a storage element, which allows you to shift when you can consume electricity, and hence restoring the balance in the electricity system. And this is
and then the storage of chlorine gas, it was there before the electricity markets were volatile, I suppose. So it was there for operational purposes, I assume.
Yeah. And of course, now going forward, you could think, if you wouldn't design a new installation or modify an existing equipment, that the enter what we call design for flexibility, that also you could consider new capex investments. Let's say a very concrete example, the 100,000 liter was an operational buffer of hot water, but you can add a second tank of 100,000 liter. It's relatively low capex for relatively a lot of megawatt hour storage. Euros per megawatt hour storage, much lower than what you would have to pay for lithium-ion battery storage.
Yeah, but I think that's a good insight. So, in fact, you could make some kind of a merit order or ladder of energy storage. With, I don't know, at the base, it's the free storage, because it's already available. It's already there because of operational boundaries or operational reasons. And then the next one is the cheapest ones. And I think indeed a tank of hot water will probably be cheaper to build than a lithium-ion battery. And then you come to the top, and what's at the top? It's the lithium-ion batteries probably.
Yeah, and of course that there is a bit of a nuance to be made. So there is new assets. There is, you could say, what is the cheapest form of storage I can have, and there is of course the assets are already there. Is always the winner, I would say. There is of course also the operational cost of storage. But typically in operational buffers, there is no real operational cost or no real loss. Of course, if you would start storing energy in a product, for instance, then you have to be very careful to consider also your opportunity cost, and then maybe that is also later in the merit order, only when it's really needed. But maybe to talk a bit about this time of storage, we often say it's a 2-hour battery or a 4-hour battery. Typically means a 4-hour battery. If you that means that you can charge during 4 hours and then discharge during 4 hours. And we know that from lithium-ion battery, the first batteries were 1-hour battery, because it's the energy part that is expensive, not the power part. It has been evolving towards 2-hour batteries, and actually now we see more a convergence to 4-hour batteries. It tends not to go forward. I think also a bit logical, because actually, there is the solar peak. And that typically lasts 4 hours roughly, between I would say, I don't know, 10 and or 11 and 3 o'clock or something like this. That is the biggest peak. So if you go beyond that storage, you have diminishing returns, which for an expensive equipment as a lithium-ion battery is an issue. So that typically somehow it stops at 4 hours. But once you look at the broader definition of energy storage, suddenly you can go to much longer durations. Maybe I don't know if you have an example of that.
Well, yeah, I think so, and it's also a bit different, I think, because as you mentioned, lithium-ion batteries, you have the power part and the energy part, and it's in fact decoupled. You can combine, and then you have a 2-hour or 4-hour battery, and it's symmetrical. You can charge it with certain megawatts, and you can discharge with a certain megawatt. With heat storage, it's a bit different. Heat storage, the charging part is defined by your assets. It's your heat pump or your gas boiler, e-boiler, the nominal power of those assets define how fast you can charge your heat storage. And the discharge of the heat storage, it's towards the process. So in fact, it's the heat demand of the process which defines how quick or how slow the buffer can be emptied. And I think that's a bit of a difference compared
it's an
to
asymmetrical battery.
It's an asymmetrical battery
in a way.
indeed.
So it requires a bit. The modeling is maybe a little bit more complex, but it's not something we can do. So we're not afraid of that. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So that was a bit about time of storage. Maybe before we move on to the valorization on the time of storage. You could even think in terms of weeks. Maybe for some people say, it's not possible. But let me give an example. On a production facility, like an incinerator plant, they burn waste and they make electricity and sell the electricity. Well, if you can store for a few days or even up to maybe 1 week of waste on the entrance where the equipment you want to incinerate, the waste is stored. If there is a large storage area, you could store for an additional week. And then in periods where there is a lot of wind and solar, run at a lower rate. And in moments when there is, let's say, the Dunkelflaut, where there is for the next week expected not much wind, not much solar, high prices expected, and then use that buffer to produce in that week. That is a form of actually a 7-day storage in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully agree. And you can take it one step further even. You can also look to seasonal storage. And it's a word that we have not spoken yet, but it's hydrogen. You can also store energy in form of hydrogen. And there it's maybe a bit similar as with fossil gas storages. That's not days, not weeks. That can be seasonal. But then again, we come back to the first point that we touched upon. Of course, when you convert electricity into hydrogen in an electrolyzer, you want to store it, seasonal or long duration storage, and convert it back again to electricity when you want to use that electricity. You will lose a lot of energy.
Yeah, the efficiency part is not great in that solution.
Indeed.
Yeah, and maybe in the later when there is really abundance of wind and solar, I think that is probably that's something that comes into play. For now, we are still lacking renewable energy. So, if we have a shortage, maybe we should try to be as efficient as possible. But you're absolutely right. The only thing is there are some industries that directly need hydrogen, but they are limited. Special cases, maybe in steel or in petrochemistry. But most of the time, you cannot use directly hydrogen, or you could burn it, but that is really a waste.
Well, yeah, I think so.
Let's try to avoid to do that. Okay, so great concepts about time of storage. But okay, we've talked a bit about the physics and the sources. Maybe we should discuss a bit how you can make money out of this. I would say maybe let me kick off by the basic principle of any commodity storage. It's always buy low, sell high. That is what everybody does. You can do it in any. You can do it with food. You can do it with gas. If you can buy it at low prices, store it and sell it at high price. So that is the basic, I would say, trading strategy: buy low, sell high. And it's also the case with industrial forms of storage. Unless the sell high is not really selling, it's just consuming less.
Consuming it. Indeed. Yeah.
Exactly. There is a second concept or second principle way of getting money. That's the famous grid balancing services or ancillary services. That's where the grid operator typically needs some kind of a plan B to restore the balance and is reserving flexibility to be activated close to real time to restore the balance, and that's the ancillary services. In this case, you're more paid for the capacity of being present and being able to react, rather than for the energy itself. But I think these are the two. But I don't know, how can you combine those?
Well, you sure can, and it can become very complex, of course, because you have many different markets, also many different of those ancillary services. To be quite technical, you have the FCR, the AFRR, the MFR, all the previous R1, R2, R3 for people who are a bit to in the ancillary service business. In fact, this is just the transmission system operator, so Elia in Belgium, who requires certain services, and those services are increasing or decreasing power with a certain rate at a certain moment. And why they need it? They need it to keep the balance of the grid, because we need to have the same amount of electricity injected as off-taken from this electricity grid. So lots of those ancillary services, and of course you can make money out of them because, as you would suspect, Elia buys these services from parties who can consume more power when requested or produce more power when requested. And you have whole market, different markets, market timings, etc. related to this. But of course, you can combine it with the wholesale trading or the wholesale markets. And so wholesale is really buying and selling energy with megawatt hours, gigawatt hours, even terawatt hours. These balancing markets, it's lesser volume. It's a more shallow market. But there you are, they also call it explicit flexibility. So there you are activated based on a certain signal. So this is a bit different than buying energy on the market. It's more like, okay, I am available, Elia in Belgium. If you want, you can activate me to, I don't know, take up the abundance of renewable energy because there is a bit more wind than predicted. But this can definitely be compared with your, so to say, normal optimization strategy where you just buy low, sell high.
Yeah, I would say if people think often when they think about storage and batteries, they think about these famous ancillary services, these really short-term markets. And okay, I understand why, because until now and in the last years, this was the most valuable part. There was more money to be gained there, but as you mentioned, it are shallow markets. So in Belgium, we only need a few hundred megawatts of those, while the offering, the supply side, now there is not so much supply, and this is why the prices are high. But once these big batteries come online, and then I'm not talking about the industrial storage we're discussing, but you also have this front of the meter large scale batteries, hundreds of megawatts, and they will all be competing for these value pockets. Indeed. And that will depress the price because it's a shallow market. They will. The prices will reduce. This is why I think people should start looking also, I would say, to these wholesale markets, because this wholesale market, that is a big, deep market, and that market will not be saturated by even 1,000 megawatt of batteries. So that will remain, and the volatility in these wholesale markets, that will also remain, because as long as there is each year so many gigawatts of wind and solar coming online, they need a counterpart, and the counterpart is actually is this storage. So indeed, I would say that's an argument to say don't forget the wholesale markets.
Indeed,
but if you can value stack it smartly, because you can combine them and somehow they compete with each other, and then we enter the territory of algorithms, because it can become quite complex, such value stacking and all these timings. But there you have value service providers who can do that and take away this complexity. Okay, excellent. I think we have to talk about one last topic on storage. Actually, it's a complex one. I was mentioning the front of the meter batteries, and maybe we have to discuss a bit about what does it mean front of the meter and behind the meter, because in an industrial context, you could, besides store energy in the process, you could also actually add a battery behind at your process. In that case, we would look at it as a behind-the-meter battery. Can you maybe explain why we have to make the difference between front of the meter and behind the meter?
Well, yeah, and then I think we're focused on the lithium-ion batteries.
For instance, yes.
Well, front of the meter, we call it this way because it's like a dedicated asset. So you invest in a lithium-ion battery, you acquire a grid connection, and you put a battery there, and you just trade on the markets. So it's a single asset behind a single meter, and you need to have a business case to discharge this battery because it's standalone. Behind the meter is different. Behind the meter, the idea there is that you put a battery or a energy storage, next to existing offtake or consumption, industrial process, or next to existing production, next to a PV park, wind park. So that's the big difference between the front of the meter and behind the meter.
Okay, but then the optimization strategies are different. And I think it's important for people to understand why is it different? Well, it's different because once you have a meter, it's the point where the grid tariffs are calculated. It's the point where if you have excess of electricity, you would inject it. If you have a shortage of electricity, you would buy it. It is on this net position where you inject or or offtake the electricity from the grid, that your grid tariffs are calculated. Because then you're using the grid.
Exactly.
And those grid tariffs are quite complex, and you pay for the use, you have a fixed fee, you have also peaks you pay for. And this makes sometimes that it is more interesting to use in general, it's always more interesting to use your own electricity behind the meter before injecting into the grid. And that makes it a bit of a different optimization strategy.
Yeah, indeed, because indeed those grid tariffs are quite complex. And if you can have multiple assets behind a single meter, so behind a meter energy storage, you can use that energy storage apart from trading on the markets, also to optimize your grid connection and optimize your capacity tariffs, etc. So that's definitely true, and it makes it a bit more complex, but that's I think challenging. So that's what we like.
Indeed. And there is also in Belgium, not yet, but I would say in the Netherlands, it's something which is already very prominent, and it will probably follow. Is the famous congestion of the net? It's not only the cost of using the grid; it's also that more and more grids are constrained, and that you cannot use it all the time. And then also again, behind the meter strategy could also help congestion.
Exactly.
I think that's important. Okay, I think we touched upon storage. It's a complex matter with many aspects, a very interesting topic. My takeaway is actually that there is much more storage than that meets the eye, that what you see at first sight. And it's actually, if you look into the value, a megawatt hour of storage, so time arbitrage, as we call it, is typically worth more than switching gas to electricity, for instance. There is more value currently in the market in storage strategies than in I would say what we call strike price strategies. So shifting between gas and electricity, for instance, in the same moment in time. So my takeaway would be, well, maybe look with a different lens to your industrial process and see what storage is there. I don't know if you would want to add a concluding remark.
I fully agree. What I want to conclude is that energy storage is not a synonym for a lithium-ion battery. So it goes way broader than this. We talked about heat storage. We talked about product storage. So I think this is something that should be taken into account when thinking about storage. It's not investing in an expensive battery. It's looking way more broader than that. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Jens. Good conversation.
Thank you, Jeroen. Bye.
Bye.